Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm George Jacob. I lead the data and AI team for energy sector within Capgemini. So today, we are going to take a quick look at the aspects of scaling generative AI in the enterprise landscape based on some of the projects that we have done over the past 18, 24 months, right? It's not been a long time since we had this. But I want to quickly do a quick rewind to kind of take a look at where generative AI is. Obviously, you all know that this is one of the fastest user-adopted technology that has been ever released, right? 100 million users in 2 months. Now, keep in mind that this is in comparison with the other numbers that are here, and note that they were all supposed to be mass adoption, built for masses, but generative AI is not necessarily built for masses to begin with until ChatGPT came, and then it just exploded, right? What that means is that it is easily adaptable, and everybody wants to use that, right? Now, fast forward today, based on some surveys, what we have found in the enterprise landscape is that the adoption is unbelievable, right? If you look at these numbers, 65% of the enterprises use generative AI in some form or fashion in the last 18 to 24 months. 75% of them use AI in some form or fashion. Keep in mind that in the past, these numbers were very low compared to what was in 2023 or before that. 72% of them use more than one department use generative AI, and 78% of them increased investments in this space. Now, compare the below numbers that shows the difference between the previous year and now. This is definitely a big thing in this landscape. Everybody is eager to scale, right? 68% of the organizations have moved some form or fashion, some POCs that they have done into production, or generative AI solutions that are moved to production. And 30% of the generative AI POCs have moved to production. Now, here is the interesting fact. The traditional AI, or classical AI as we call it now for the last 2 years, only 20% of the POCs ever went to production over the 10-year span. Compared to the 12 months, we are achieving 30%. So that's a big, significant achievement. So what does this mean for us to looking forward to 2025? This is the time when we are going to be scaling at a massive adoption. The enterprise landscape is not about POCs, right? Enterprise landscape is about building solutions that are scalable and usable by a large number of users across the enterprise. And that is what we are going to look at. Few aspects that we have seen in the industry. So how do we win, as in like, how do we make sure that we are able to successfully implement solutions on in the enterprise landscape? So before I go a little more deeper, let's look at generative AI. The approach, or if you think about generative AI, we usually talk about productivity, value delivered, and adoption. So in that landscape, you can visualize it in a 3-tier form, and the first one is the self-service, which we are all familiar with, right? We have used so many different tools and technologies that are available there. These are massively adopted, but not necessarily providing great value for the business. The second one is the generic functions. A good example is the developer tools that are available, right? These are going to be adopted by lesser number of people from an enterprise or organization perspective, but that provides more value. And then the last one, that's the core differentiator. The solutions that are going to help you change or address the core business processes within the organization. That's where the focus is in terms of going forward, and that's where you need the scaling aspects of the enterprise scaling aspects. Last but not the least, we also see a layer underlying all of these, and the most common pattern that we hear is RAG, right? So enterprise knowledge libraries, where you have different knowledge bases catering to different group of users. And all of that, if you build the right way with the right architecture and solution, that can be leveraged and adopting faster than ever before. So that's kind of the overall picture in terms of productivity and value delivered against the adoption. So when you talk about how do we win this game in the enterprise, there are a few aspects that we need to be aware of. First of all, we need to make sure that we have a vision that is set within the organization, which is relevant to the organization, which is practical, and that's something that can be actionable to deliver value. So if you look at these 4 aspects, the first one you have to be able to align with the organizational goals as well as the strategy, and deliver value to make sure that it can contribute towards the strategic goals of the organization. Second one, the opportunities that are there, and I'll have a couple of other slides in terms of how do we filter this down, but the opportunities and risks, not just looking at identifying the use cases, but also think about, if I don't do it, is that okay? Or my competitor is going to get ahead of us, right? So that kind of risk analysis is something that we should be thinking about. Operating model on how are we going to manage this landscape going forward, not just from a technology infrastructure perspective, but also how do we scale? And this is something that is going to be adopting very fast, in the sense like the changes that you need to do are going to be consistent or much more than what we have seen in the other application landscape. You build a software for user interaction, that's probably done, and the maintenance will tail off, right? But in this case, generative AI may not be that way. It has to be consistently updated, at least for the coming few years. So it is very important to make sure that we have a right operating model with the competency within the organization setup. And last but not the least, technology and infrastructure. Picking the right technology, making sure that it is interoperable, right? Making sure that we are not just building everything, but where we can buy, where it is valuable, you buy that instead of building it. So all these aspects are important to start a journey. Now, when you pick the use cases, where to play, right? That is important. You have to look at your organization to see whether the business can adapt and adopt the technologies. That is also important. And do we have the right champions within the organization? That's not only for POC on what's the area that you're going to pick to move forward. That is also important in terms of how to win. And there are a few aspects listed here. The science and technology behind this need to be understood well before we embark on this journey. On the right side, it again need to be aligned to the organizational goals and strategy. Look at the overall portfolio of the organization, look at the opportunities that exist in terms of generative AI, look at the priorities of the organization and the opportunities, and then pick your top bets. And if you look at the 5 dimensions that we have mentioned there, definitely look for the feasibility, right? Not every use case that is out there, that are listed there, may be feasible for within your organization or based on the current technology. Something to think about. Strategic value, we already talked about that. Business buy-in, extremely important, right? Is the business ready to change the business process to adapt to the newer technologies and opportunities that you are bringing there? Opportunity to learn. Sometimes we have to build something so that we can learn, and then making sure that that learning can be applied to the other areas of the business. That's also important. And last but not the least, think about the flagship projects that you have in your organization that are already in motion or coming up shortly. How can generative AI help them? Sometimes tagging along with that would make your life easy, especially in the change management perspective. On the right side, what you're seeing is and this is just the same use case adoption or a use case prioritization for most of the use cases, not just generative AI. Look at it from the business functions perspective, what is the value it's delivering, and then against that, make a deliberate decision rather than just picking something that is not necessarily valued within the organization. So that is also an important aspect. Now, to structure the organization to succeed in this journey, it is important to make sure that these boxes or these pillars are covered. Strategy and architecture, we talked about that a little bit, extremely important. Ensure that you have a COE. This is a new technology. Not everybody understands the intricacies of the technology, so make sure that you have a core team that can cater to that. And then the top 4 boxes that you're seeing are the different type of use cases that we have seen. Try to group the use cases in a way that it is, as you mentioned here, there may be other ways of doing it too, but software engineering, the developer tools that we are talking about, there are different aspects to it. Things to cover there. How will it align with your enterprise architecture, enterprise standards? Those are things to be considered. Customer experience, this is another common area where we see a lot of traction. Knowledge assistant, I will talk about that a little more, but that's the most common use case that we have seen, essentially interacting with the data or corpus that we have in very ChatGPT style interface. Last but not the least, there are complicated use cases, and that's where scaling becomes extremely important. Along with the COE, it is a good idea to have a future lab, in the sense like you can have a core team that is focusing on trying out different options, And that is also something very important for infrastructure because they need to be able to secure an area and give it to you for testing and not necessarily for everybody, right? So the future lab can have a much more open standard established in terms of infrastructure and security. Applied innovation exchange and partners. Leverage the partners to get the ideas in terms of what kind of use cases they are working on, what have they been successful on, right? Not every use case may be feasible, so you have to leverage those partner point of views and make sure that we can address or make sure that we are successful in those areas. Now, how to scale? This is where I'm going to share some of our lessons learned, and I'm sharing a bunch of use cases that we have successfully scaled, and I'll leave it here. It's not for us to read now, maybe offline, you can take a look at that. There are various different type of use cases that we have implemented, and these learnings are going to be based on those use cases that we have delivered. The key considerations, key questions that we ask every time we start a project is this going to be a good fit for the business? Is it feasible with the technology that we have? Not just for POC, but in a scalable manner. Right? That is extremely important. And then the next question is, do we have the data, or the documents, or the media that is required? That is also important. And the data has to be in a curated form, not just like dumped into one place, right? That will confuse the models, that may create additional opportunity for hallucination and things like that. So it's extremely important to make sure that we have the complete and correct data for the exercise. Change management. Whose KPI are we impacting? Why are we doing this? Can the business adopt? Can the business process change? Who will benefit out of this? Those are important. And last but not the least, depending on the use case, can this be bias-free? Can this be free of any legal implications, risks to the organization? Those are the factors that we start with. Then, before we even move to the technology scaling aspect, it is important to make sure we have the right processes for implementing this solution. When you look at SDLC, which is very rarely used these days, I think, but for generative AI solutions, it is not very different from traditional AI or typical AI solutions that are built. There is always a define, experiment, build, pilot, and rollout phase, right? But there are some subtle factors here which are extremely important. If you look at the second box, typically when we do any project, we actually break down the business processes, maybe level 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we go and implement the solutions associated with that. But here, you may have to think about how the user is thinking about it. Their thought process might have to be broken down because your goal is to write some prompts that are going to mimic those to get the results that the user is expecting. So that is important. And I already talked about the data. It is extremely important to make sure that we have the right, complete data sets curated and ready to move. Second, in the experiment phase, another change that we are observing is we don't have to wait for the end of the project or end of the cycle build to be completed to start testing. We can start testing the prompts right away. And it is important we identify the guardrails and the type of the prompt, how we write that upfront before we get into the pilot phase and the subsequent phases. Here is another difference. We don't have to wait for, or we should not be depending on user acceptance testing like how we do before. We have to pilot it with a larger set of users, not just the people that actually define the solution. Because we are most likely dealing with a lot of thought process people are going to be thinking about. A good example is document analysis. Different people analyze the documents different ways, so you have to be able to capture that breadth of the thought process. Last but not the least, our experience is that it's better to limit the pilot group and phase by phase roll it out by region or language, depending on how big you are thinking about, right? So that's a good approach that we have been seeing. Earlier I talked about enterprise knowledge library, and here is an example of how we implemented that at the enterprise level. Typically what we have seen is RAG pattern is very common, so it's very easy to implement, so everybody builds their own chatbots. I have a chatbot, you have a chatbot, soon it will be like the McDonald's farm, right? Everybody has a chatbot. That's not what we want. We want to make sure that we are able to build something at the enterprise level which is reusable. So think about the same approach that you're taking for individual use case, but scale it a little bigger. You have different knowledge bases sitting within the enterprise knowledge library and those can be specific to use case or shared across the use cases. Now you're able to reuse all the different components that are in the RAG. Chunking is a great example. There are so many different ways of chunking it, and it will be probably reused in every single project that we are doing. So all of that can be reused, and if you build it in a scalable way, like a Kubernetes or something like that, then it becomes very easy. So the best example that I can tell you is taking 4 to 6 months to build the whole solution, and then we are able to roll out another use case every 2 to 3 weeks. That's a big benefit of doing it this at enterprise scale, because most of the time, it's the same user experience that everybody is expecting, but yes, you can customize it if you need to as well. Now, this one got a lot of colored boxes, so bear with me on that. On the left side, and this is again, how do we make sure that we can scale, right? Just simple few tips that you should keep in mind. One, on the left side, you see the core services. So the large language model services that you're using, you might end up using multiple of them depending on the scenario. But what I want to highlight is the next box, which is the core guardrails. So a good example for that is if you're in an enterprise setting, you can actually make sure that at the enterprise level, you block any kind of profanity or other things that the model can reply, right? So that is done at the enterprise level. And then you have different AI services, right? Different features, different type of implementation that you need from AI perspective. So those can be the next block of different AI services, and then each of them can have its own guardrails. So if you have chat, then maybe you can control the tone and those kind of services. Best match retrieval, right? That can have its own set of guardrails. And then these services can be used by the agents. And then that can be orchestrated and provided to the applications. It looks like multiple layers, but it is not that difficult to implement if you follow this approach. Now, if you build all of these things on some technology that is very scalable, that is extremely important, rather than just building individual blocks, right? And obviously, knowledge library I talked about, that kind of fits into that pattern. So from an enterprise perspective, when you think about building something, you want to step back, especially in the coming days, you want to step back and think, can we do something that is at the enterprise level, especially in these kind of situations? Do we have to do something at the enterprise level, or can I just have everybody build their own simple solutions? That's the key message that we need to keep in mind. So, in 2025, we are hopefully going to see a lot of adoption, and I'm optimistic about this technology and looking forward for the coming days. Thank you very much for taking time.